going to start it back, but it will be 2 separate ones now. I apologize for that. I'd love to hear what you all discussed in your group. So does anybody want to share, you know, what their group said in terms of kind of specifically with your agency? What are some ways that you can take one of these values and really practically do something at your agency?
Go. I had said dignity and worth of a person can sometimes get tricky. I'm a school social worker, so we're working with kids age 3 to 24, and so it can sometimes get lost when you're sitting around a table talking about the 4-year-old who, you know, and you're having to make big decisions for them, or the 18-year-old where you're discussing, do we put them on a gen ed diploma or a SPED diploma? You know, you're changing the trajectory of their lives. And oftentimes parents conflict with the school team, and the school and conflicts with me. And how do I, you know, how do you navigate that? And so it can be really difficult as a social worker being on an education multidisciplinary team. So just being aware of it and balancing, what does dignity and worth of a client look like, and who's the client in that situation? And, you know, we have just so many when you're sitting around a table like that. So that's what I said.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think, does that say Capri as your name? Capri, thank you so much for sharing. You know, you're absolutely right. And that really does manifest itself on these interprofessional teams where, you know, the social worker is presenting with this code of ethics, but not everybody else on the team feels that same way, you know. So maybe the reframe is, how do we as social workers, even when we're on these interprofessional or interdisciplinary teams, how do we make sure that we are advocating for the dignity and worth of that student? How are we making sure to remind everybody, right, that this student and this person is valuable? It's he or she or they are not just a number, right? But how are we advocating for everybody else in the room to prioritize and to see that student as someone who is dignified, even if they're 4 years old, right? And so I think that that's another piece to this is, you know, sometimes we are the ones who have to not just remember that dignity and worth is one of our values, but to really advocate and educate people who are on our team about what that looks like and why that's important. So that's an excellent point, Capri. Anybody else with another example? That was a great one. Yes, Sarah, Curtis.
So kind of along with Capri, I work with Capri, I'm one of her coworkers, but in the school system, social justice can get very, very difficult. And I shared that was the one that I struggle with currently because, you know, when I was in undergrad and graduate school, living in Knoxville, living on a college campus in a bigger city, those opportunities are super easy to find, right? It's, you know, it's not difficult to find a protest or, you know, different ways that you can engage in social justice. Moving into a smaller town, you know, it's a lot more difficult. We have to actually seek out those opportunities, and I find myself not doing that as much as I should. And then within the constraints of a school system, you know, you're working in a very political environment, and the culture of the school system, regardless of where you are, has a big impact on, you know, as social workers, kind of what we're allowed to say or feel like we're allowed to say and do. And so navigating that, especially this past year, has been difficult. And, you know, I think it's important as social workers that we don't lose sight of how important we are to that discussion for other people.
Yeah, Sarah, I love that. And I thank you so much for sharing that, because that is true, right? There are certain restrictions, certain things that you're allowed to do and that you're not allowed to do. And then, you know, exposure, right? Some of you all are in smaller communities where the community may not be as supportive of, you know, some sort of social justice movement. I think, again, how can we continue to, as social workers, bring that to the forefront? How can we advocate for that? I know that a school that I'm still pretty closely involved with this year started a Black Lives Matter club. And I know that it's not a social worker, but one of their teachers is really committed to that and said, you know, I don't know what I'm allowed to do, but I just want to provide space for anybody who is supportive of our Black students. So it's actually a very mixed racial group of kids and middle schoolers. I want to provide space for them. And then a guidance counselor at that same school started a GSA club, right? Because she also was seeing that there were lots and lots of students starting to have questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. And so, you know, sometimes it's just being able to provide the space. And then even if you can't do that because your principal or the people above you won't allow that, I think always just reiterating and letting those kids who are your clients know that you are here and you are available and you are safe, right? So Sarah and Capri bring up a huge thing, and that there are different levels as to how you approach this and what this looks like in your agency. For some of you who work in agencies with a lot of social workers, you know, how this plays out for you is going to look very different than people who are on multidisciplinary teams in bureaucracies with lots of regulations, right? And so again, how do you advocate? How do you provide space? How do you let your clients know? Because we want what's best outcomes for the client. How do you let your client know that you are there with them, that you see them like at the very beginning, and that even if it feels like their school or their community around them does not, that you are reinforcing these values of you're worthy. We are going to do what we can to serve you as best as we can within the constraints that we can. We are going to care about the social justice issues that you care about. And because of that, we're prioritizing this relationship. So thank you, Capri and Sarah, for sharing. I really appreciate that. We're going to go ahead. I'm looking at our time. We're going to get through it all. I promise. We're going to go ahead and share some more. Okay, so let's see, where are we on the PowerPoint? We're going to talk about the ethical standards now. Okay, so we have our first ethical standard, 1.05, cultural awareness and social diversity, right? So we were talking about values and principles. Now we're talking about what are our standards, right? So our very first standard is our ethical responsibilities to our clients. So as you're thinking about those kids at your school, as you're thinking about the individuals that you work with in your hospital setting, as you think about your private practice clients, we want to also prioritize cultural awareness and social diversity. So this is exactly from the Code of Ethics. This is exactly what it says. But two of the things that I want to highlight, right, are in section A, where it says social workers should understand culture and its function in human behavior and society, recognizing that strengths exist in all cultures. Okay, that is critical, that we are able to recognize that strengths exist in cultures. And, you know, we say that social work, everything that we do is we try from a strengths-based perspective. This is where it comes from, okay? We have to recognize as a profession that it is our ethical responsibility to our client to see the strength that they present with from their culture, right? And when they can't see that because they do not value their culture and they do not see positive images of their culture, then it's the social worker's ethical responsibility to say, hey, here are the strengths that I see in your culture. Another thing that we're going to pull out from that is in section C. Social workers should obtain education and seek to understand the nature of social diversity and oppression, right? So what does that mean? And we have a slide to kind of talk about that a little bit. I'm going to back up and talk about strengths, and then I'll talk about social diversity and oppression. But if we're talking again about the strengths and teasing that out from section 1.05, what we're saying is there are strengths that exist in every culture, and we have been conditioned to see differences as negative. That is just true, right? We have been conditioned to see differences as negative. So sometimes we have clients who see their difference as a negative, right? But what the code of ethics says is it points us to focus on strengths. So that is what we do as an ethical responsibility to our clients, is we focus on their strengths. We also have to have an understanding. Our code of ethics says, hey, look, if you're going to be a social worker, then your ethical responsibility to clients is to really make sure that you understand social diversity and oppression. This goes back to that conversation that we had at the beginning about intersectionality, right? As social workers, we need to make sure that we have an understanding and we have an awareness of the diversity and oppression that our clients have experienced. We cannot separate the people group from the historical or current oppression, right? So that means we may need to have conversations about race-based trauma or gender-based violence and trauma or cultural trauma, collective trauma. We need to have those conversations because it impacts our clients and our communities. So that is what section 1.05 really says about, and I've just highlighted these two things about the strengths-based focus of all cultures. And then also, as social workers, our personal responsibility in that is to be aware of the social diversity and oppression that people face. So what about our ethical responsibility to the broader society? So we're going to jump from, we were at 1 at the very beginning of our code of ethics, of the ethical standards, and now we're jumping down to section 6, right? So section 6.01 talks about social welfare, and it says social workers should promote the general welfare of society from local to global levels and the development of people, their communities, and their environments. Social workers should advocate for living conditions that are conducive to the fulfillment of basic human needs and should promote social, economical, political, and cultural values and institutions that are compatible with the realization of social justice. So this is our responsibility for the broader society, right? The reason that these conversations about cultural humility and anti-racism are so important is because our code of ethics gives us this framework for why this is priority for our profession, right? So if we think about the social welfare ethical standard, then we think about development. How are we developing our clients, their communities, and their environments? Similar to service, how do we do this authentically, right? If you go back, it says the development of people, their communities, and their environments. That is what our role is. That is what we should be doing. How do we do that? How do we do that authentically? And how do you develop something without appreciating its culture? It cannot happen. Just like you can't prioritize the importance of human relationships if you don't appreciate someone's culture. So what our profession does is our profession says, look, we're calling you, if you're going to be a social worker, we are going to expect that these are the things that you are doing for your clients and for the broader community. So with that is promoting social justice. The code of ethics points us to promote social justice, right? So not just to intellectually understand it, right? But to also promote it. And again, what Capri and Sarah have shown us is that is going to look different depending upon your setting, depending upon your community, but we are supposed to promote social justice. And think about, how does your agency do that? How do you do that within your agency? As a professional social worker, how do you promote social justice? How do you bring that to the forefront? So that is our ethical responsibility to the broader society. And then last, as a drill down, and then we'll talk about kind of some secondary ways that we see this play out, is 6.04, right? Social and political action. Social workers should engage in social and political action that seeks to ensure that all people have equal access to resources, employment, services, and opportunities that they require to meet their basic needs and to develop fully. This is a big call, right? This is a huge, huge ethical standard that what we are supposed to do is to ensure that all people have equal access to these resources, right? How are we doing that? Social workers should also, Section C, promote conditions that encourage respect for cultural and social diversity within the United States and globally. Okay, social workers should act, Section D, to prevent and eliminate domination of, exploitation of, and discrimination against any person, group, or class, right? This is how we fit in this idea of cultural humility. And I would dare to say that 1.05, 6.01, and 6.04 dispel this myth of cultural competence, right? Even though it says that in one of these, it actually uses the phrase cultural competence, because what we are doing is saying we value the person enough. We know the person's worth and value enough that we're caring about the injustice and the oppression and the intersectionality of their identities, to take that information and to make change with it, to take that information and to connect them to resources, to take that information and to help move them in the direction of better outcomes. So maybe in a situation that our volunteers gave us earlier, maybe in the school setting, right? If there are things that you are not allowed to do, maybe what you do is you connect those clients to resources that help support them. Maybe you say, okay, I know that this child is Black. I know that this child lives here. I know that this child is a female. I know that this child, take what you know, because you prioritize knowing the person, take what you know and connect them to appropriate resources. So equal access, 6.04. says resources, employment services, and opportunities, right? That's what we do. We're fighting for equality. Awareness of how the political arena affects practice. There was a lot that happened over the last year that really affected, a lot that happened politically that affected practice. It affected practice for many of your clients. It affected practice for many of your communities and your agencies. And it is important that we as social workers understand what that looks like so that we can continue to fight for this equal access for our clients. Equal access also talks about advocating for changes in policy and legislation, right? So I will give you an example of this. There is a bill right now in the state of Tennessee. We're all in Tennessee, I'm assuming. And it has been passed in the House. I do not think it has gone before the Senate yet, but maybe it was passed in the House a few days ago. And it is the Teachers Discipline Act. and someone approached the Coalition of Black Social Workers and said, hey, we want you guys to take a look at this bill because in a nutshell, we think that if it's passed, it will create more detrimental effects for African-American youth because of some of the language in the bill and what it would mean. And so that's important for us to know, because in our organization, we also have a lot of school social workers who work intimately with children. And it's important for them to know that this, if passed, could really affect a huge percentage of their population, right? So how do we maintain awareness and then also share that awareness with our clients so that it's not just us writing letters or us calling our representatives, but that we get the clients involved in that as well. Promote conditions. We want to promote conditions and respect for cultural and social diversity. So the Code of Ethics points us to promote equity, to promote policies that are equitable, right? How long has it been since you've looked at policies at your work and thought, are these equitable? Like, have we had a conversation about these hiring policies, right? And these promotion practices? Are these things equitable? And are we on the side where we are promoting that? And then the last piece of 6.04 talks about preventing discrimination. And the Code of Ethics points us to eliminate any and all forms of discrimination. And so again, as we're thinking about this idea of cultural humility, we cannot eliminate something that we don't know about. Right? So if we don't have an understanding, if we're not doing the work to really understand and engage with other cultures and communities to see what it is that they're experiencing, then there's no way that we're able to fulfill 6.04 under prevent discrimination. So it all works together. It's all interconnected. There are just a few more. We won't really drill these down. But I did just want to point out under ethical responsibility to colleagues. So we talked about clients, we talked about the broader society, to colleagues. So the people that you work with, really this idea of respecting your colleagues who are different is very important. In social workers, ethical responsibility as professionals, again, this idea of eliminating discrimination, that is something that we're working to eradicate as social workers. And then in section 5, social workers' ethical responsibilities to the social work profession, where it talks about integrity of the profession, right? Our profession centers people. And so to uphold the ethical principles of our profession, cultural humility has to be something that we engage with. So I'm looking at the time, and I do want to have a few time for a few minutes for questions. So I'm gonna, go through this, but if at any point, please feel free to reach out and to ask a question. And so what we're going to do, Rebecca, I got your message. I can definitely send that to you for sure. Why is this so hard, right? Like, this is hard. Everything about this just feels like weight, right? And some of you have restrictions in your agencies of what you're allowed to do. Some of you all, are probably looking at this like, what in the world? This is hard. Understanding cultural humility and being able to really execute that and implement that with fidelity and with authenticity is really, really challenging. And so one of the reasons when we think about why this is so hard is when we look at who are social workers. Right? So our social work statistics show us that 83% of social workers are female and 17% are male. But when we think about race and the racial breakdown of social workers, almost 70% of social workers, this is just America, almost 70% of social workers in America are white. And from the gender, we can tell that they're mostly white women. So social work is a white, female dominated profession. So other BIPOC are not substantially represented. Black Americans are the next highest with almost 22%. White Americans are at 70%. It is not a very diverse profession when you think about the clinicians who are actually providing services, right? So what is important, why that is important, is because we as a profession, so as an educator who teaches and shapes social work students, we need to be doing a better job as educators, really preparing our white females, because that is what dominates our profession, on how to engage around conversations about culture and cultural humility and anti-racism, how to interact with clients who are not white women, clients who are different than them, how to understand their own intersections so that when they're working alongside of, across the table with a client who is different than them, they have a full self-awareness of what that feels like or what that could project to that client, right? So some of this is really hard just because we have not really taken the time in our profession to drill this down and to have these conversations. Now, over the last year, we have had so many conversations and there have been so many webinars and so many panels, right? And so we want to keep that same energy going so that as we look to the future of social work, as we look to what this profession will look like 10 years down the road, that we can stand side by side with our code of ethics and say, yes, we do that. Yes, we do service. Yes, we do social justice. Yes, we prioritize the dignity and worth of every person, regardless of what they look like or their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their religion. Yes, social work does that, okay? And one of the reasons why that's important, one of the reasons is it's important for us to figure that out, is the statistics show that our nation is trending. And our nation is trending to be, for the first time in a situation, for the first time since they've counted statistics, that is what I will say, that we are in a situation where by 2045, the US will be minority white, right? So the landscape, the racial and ethnic makeup of our nation is changing, and social workers need to be ahead of that game. Social workers need to be the trainers of what it means to be culturally humble, what it means for an organization to work and to fit with multiple people of different backgrounds coming together. Social work needs to model that, because that's what it says in our code of ethics. So we need a paradigm shift, right? I think everybody, after the events over the last year, I think it was brought to people's attention in a more forceful way that we need a paradigm shift. So what we have typically said is we want to coexist, right? We've gotten that wrong. We have focused either on the system or the individual to try to figure out how to be culturally competent or culturally humble or anti-racist. We focused a lot on tolerance, right? Okay, I'm going to tolerate you. I'm going to coexist with somebody who's totally different than me, right? But the idea of coexisting, the idea of tolerance, is not acceptance. Coexistence and acceptance is not the same, period. You can coexist with somebody around a boardroom table and not know them, not appreciate their cultures, not take into account their intersectionality. Coexist says, I'm going to continue to lead with white supremacy, with whiteness, right? Period. So that I can say, yes, these are the things that I've done. I put these people at my table. We are coexisting together. We are tolerating one another. The difference is we have to move from a place of just tolerating and coexisting to a place of belonging, right? In your agencies, they might say inclusion, right? So we don't want to just be included. We want to belong, right? Which again, we go all the way back to those values. Dignity and worth of a person says, looks them in the eye and says, you matter and you belong here. I'm not just going to tolerate you, you belong here. So what does that mean, right? How do we do that? We follow our code of ethics. Our code of ethics is very clear about valuing all people. Our code of ethics is very clear about prioritizing the needs of the oppressed, the vulnerable, the individuals who are on the margins of our society. That is who we prioritize. The code of ethics doesn't use that word prioritize. It uses the phrase pay particular attention to, right? So I say prioritize, but the actual language is pay particular attention to, or with particular attention to. Our code of ethics already gives us a blueprint. Our code of ethics already gives us a call to racism. And this is what we have to understand. The beauty of social work is that we understand that it's not just prioritizing the person, right? We understand that it's the person in the environment. We understand that it's not just micro versus macro, right? We understand we need them both. Anti-racism is the exact same. Anti-racism is a two-way street. It simultaneously requires both a system change and an individual change. The system says, okay, we're making this change because it's necessary and it will benefit the public, right? We're making this change to integrate schools because it is necessary and it will be beneficial to the public, right? That's what the system says. So we created this policy to change the system. But the individuals that make up that system must say, you belong here, you are valued, you matter. So it doesn't matter if there's this big systemic change and schools are integrated. Brown versus the Board of Education. Yay, this must be the best thing ever. But if the white people in that community move out of the community once that school is integrated, then the systemic change that they thought was going to make things better doesn't work. So we need both the system to make the change and the individuals who make up that system to say, you belong here, you are valued, you matter. We need both. And social work gives us a picture of that, right? Social work understands that it takes all of the different levels. We focus on person in the environment. We do that. That's how we've been trained. That's what our code of ethics says. That's what we do. So we have all of the tools that we need in order to do this and to make a real impact and a real difference. Social workers respond to the culture. So this is Alan Detlef, and he said I pulled this after everything with George Floyd this summer, and he wrote a piece and said, as social workers, we need to stand strongly and firmly against the racism and white supremacy that continue to take the lives and threaten the freedoms of every Black American in our country. So he's saying, you know what? As social workers, because we've seen all these things that have happened, we need to take a stand and we need to speak out to that because we understand that this affects our clients, person, and environment, right? And so, how many other issues have we seen where social workers have been the ones responding, where social workers have been the ones on the front lines, where social workers have said, hey, this is how you do this. This is how you engage with this population that is vulnerable and oppressed and marginalized, because that is what our code of ethics points us to. Social workers are anti-racist. Our code of ethics says that very clearly, that that is the philosophy by which we're moving, right? We move through. So as we're thinking about wrapping up here, some of you may have seen this if you've, I did an anti-racism, is anti-racism enough talk back in September with the NASW and the CBSW. And for that particular talk, I created these profiles. And the profiles kind of show the difference between show how the individual and the system change interacts with one another. And so if you've heard that talk, then maybe you've seen this before. But as we're talking about the code of ethics, and as we're talking about how social workers are culturally humble and anti-racist, I thought it was good to dig it back out again. So these three different profiles are safe, change agent, and disruptive, right? And so you're thinking about what it means to be a safe anti-racist, right? That's a little work on a systems level, and that's someone who is performative and valuing themselves, right? So remember, when we talked about our values, our social work values, and we talked about that value of service, one of the things that the Code of Ethics says about service is, you know, you're valuing others over your own self-interest, right? Well, this is the flip of that. This is, I'm valuing this performative other over anything else. So, and here are some examples of that. So we won't go through all of these, but I'll just highlight a few. This type of individual will be kind. Kindness is really important to them. They will be kind. They will encourage the creation of a diversity position at their job, right? All good things. They will visit civil rights museums. Their understanding of themselves in relationship, however, to the BIPOC community is they will think, this is the person who said, I took the class, I checked the box, it was on my comprehensive exam and I passed that, so I'm good. So this is the type of person who says, you know what, I'm gonna just love everybody, love conquers all, and I already understand all that stuff about different cultures, about BIPOC, and I'm good, right? That's the safe profile. Then we have another profile. And this is the change agent, right? So the change agent does some work on a systems level and some work on an individual level, right? So a change agent might be someone that writes a letter to the city council members, right? A change agent may or may not attend a protest, but they're going to read books about justice. They're going to attend workshops about anti-racist. They're even going to educate their children. They are going to read anti-racist books to their own children. They are going to read about other cultures. Remember how we talked about this idea of intergroup contact, about how you're immersing yourself? They're not immersing themselves, but they are doing some education, right? They are reading. They're not really holding, you know, their religious institution accountable for any racist beliefs or policies or practices that might be going on, but they're taking some steps, right? They're moving in the right direction. The disruptive anti-racist. And I would claim that our code of ethics, with its focus on eliminating discrimination. That's 6.04 when it talks about, I'm sorry, 6.01 where it talks about social reform and talks about the elimination of discrimination, and 6.04 where it talks about social and political action, the elimination of discrimination. I would dare to say that our code of ethics wants us to be here in this disruptive anti-racist category as individuals who focus on how to change and dismantle harmful systems while also proactively valuing others. I think our code of ethics puts us here. So what does this look like? This looks like someone who is advocating for BIPOC colleagues to have leadership positions. This is someone who's using their privilege, whatever that privilege may be, on behalf of the other individuals, because our service value says to exalt others, you know, other than above ourselves. So this is someone who's doing this. This is someone who's speaking up to challenge decisions that are harmful, that are made by local, state, and national representatives and officials, right? Most specifically, calling them to change those systems that are the most harmful to the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our community. These are the people who are saying, you know what? I am going to encourage ongoing conversations about injustice in my workplace and in the world. And I'm going to sit down with my colleagues and we're going to talk about these things. I'm also going to do the same thing in my family. I realize that no matter how much I work on this, no matter how many books I read or how many anti-racist workshops that I go to, that this is not something that I'm ever going to fully understand or be an expert in, but I'm trying to. And I'm going to hold whatever institutions accountable for the perpetuation of racism. I think this is where our code of ethics calls us to be, through our values, through our standards, and through our principles. This last slide, we're not going to break out. We don't have time, but because I want to leave some time for questions, but do think that it's important to do some self-reflection, right? Where are you professionally? Where's your agency operate professionally on issues surrounding cultural humility and social justice? Where are you professionally as you implement the practices of the code of ethics? How can you start to make some changes in a direction that's more in line with what our code of ethics says? Social workers, you know, practice what we preach in our code of ethics, because if we do not, we run the risk of re-traumatizing fragile clients and fragile individuals, but also we run the risk of re-traumatizing our colleagues of color or our colleagues who present with some sort of difference if we are not actively engaged in our ethical standards, principles, and values. If we are not valuing the inherent dignity and worth of all people, then we are not living out our code of ethics. And when we mess up, because this is hard work, and so we will mess up. You will mess up, I will mess up. I mess up countless times. My colleagues will mess up, but we have to move forward, right? There is you know, terminology that I'm sure all of you have heard, white fragility, and Robin DiAngelo, you know, has written that book, and she talks about how white fragility makes you stuck, right? This guilt or this idea, this good, bad binary idea of, you know, messing up and coming to terms with what's really going on inside of you, that will be crippling to you. And so when we mess up, know that you're going to, and when you do, own it and move on, right? Because sitting in guilt and sitting in shame is an act of privilege. That's from a place of privilege. And that's the opposite of being culturally humble. That's the opposite of anti-racism. And then the great Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So those are kind of some of the phrases that I wanted to just leave you with, that our code of ethics really calls us to a high standard. And if you've never done a deep dive and looking at that through the lens of what it means to be culturally humble or anti-racist, then I really, really would challenge you to sit with that code of ethics, because it really calls us to such a high standard. And it is so fascinating and so different than any other profession. We are really blessed to have this document that lays it out for us and that provides us with the blueprint, right? Provides us with checks and balances and accountability as we work specifically with clients that we prioritize, that are vulnerable, that are disenfranchised, that are marginalized. That is who our code of ethics prioritizes. And it calls us to the standard to continue to learn, continue to grow, continue to do both the internal work, but also the external work, right? So that's it, y'all. That's all I got. We have about 11 minutes. I don't know if there are any questions, but I'm happy to take questions. I also will put my email address in the chat, just in case, anybody has wants to email me afterwards. I'll also put the CVSW's website in the chat in case anybody wants information about that. But what are your questions? Any questions? Oh, thank you so much, Annie. Thank you so much. And really the work is the work is y'all's, right? Like, you all are the ones who deserve the accolades and the energy that it took to be here and to really kind of hold space with things that are really hard to talk about. And so you really should applaud yourself, because this is hard and this is lifelong. And when you commit to be a social worker, you commit to take on things that nobody else wants to take on. You commit to listen to stories of people who are hurt and who are broken and who are hopeless. And we are supposed to empower them and encourage them and infuse them with hope. And so my job today was just to remind you that that is who you are. And in order to really take it to the next level, understanding this from a culturally humble perspective really makes a huge difference for client outcomes. I think I see a question. Would you speak to working with clients that are actively speaking in racist terms? Okay, yeah, Annie, do you want to give a little more context around that? Are these minority clients who are using racist terms? Are these, non-minority clients who are using racist terms?
My clinic is very diverse racially and economically, but I would more say I would like to hear from clients that are white speaking or making inferences about even not directly openly, but kind of roundabout where you're picking up on it, but trying to meet them where they are, but also feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, I love that. So I would say for any client who is not, I mean, not even just like blatant racist terms, but even any client who, or coworker who is using microaggressions, right? Who is framing negative, stereotypical image like things into expression that is really harmful. I mean, I think it's always important to get to a place with that client where you have built that relationship, right? You've prioritized their dignity and worth. And for you to be able to honestly say, I have noticed that this type of language is a pattern. You've brought it up a couple different times in our sessions. And I've noticed that this could be really, really hurtful and disrespectful and damaging to someone who is, if they're using a racial slur for somebody who's Latinx, or using a racial slur for somebody who is Black or African American. And I think that we call it out. I think you let your client know that that's not acceptable. And I think you can use the code of ethics to do that. I think that you can say, hey, as your social worker who really values you, I need you to know that when you use this type of language, it devalues my other clients who are from this racial group, or who do present from this particular culture. And because I value you so much, I want to make you aware of that. And I'm happy to dialogue about how to change that perspective and how to create more awareness around you. Because, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, one of my dearest friends is a Black social worker, and she used to work in adoption, and she was in a rural county in Tennessee. And when she got there, there was a 15-year-old white individual who called her the N-word. She was like, "Oh, hey, the N's here." That's what she said. That's what she said. And so my friend is telling me the story, and I'm asking her, I said, "Whoa, okay. So how did you process that?" And she said, "Carmen, to be honest with you, I was so shocked. I was like knocked off of my feet, because I was like, what is happening in this moment?" And she said, "And then I realized, in order to be culturally humble in this moment, I need to realize that this 15-year-old girl," or however, she was like a mid-teenager, I think she was 15, "that she has been raised in a very small rural white town by a grandmother who uses this language to refer to Black and brown people all the time. So I had to take a step back and say, this is her cultural context. And so what I'm going to do, even though this is really hard for me in this moment, is I'm going to correct her." And she did. And she said, "You know what? It is 2015 and this is not what we're doing." So she corrected the young lady, and that client, she and that client ended up becoming very, very close and developing a very strong relationship. And she attributes that to understanding the context of where this young lady was coming from and being aware of that, right? Realizing that she had the power in that situation, right? As the social worker who was coming to the home, she was the one with the power. And then she gently corrected her and said, "You know what? I need you to value me. I'm going to value you. We're going to spend some time together. So in order for you to value me, this is what I need from you." So I think calling it out, because some of our clients, again, we don't know what their intersections are. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what's happening in their households and what they're learning. So I think constantly thinking every opportunity is a teachable moment really is really important, because you might be the only person who's telling that client that, right? Everybody else in her community or in her household might just affirm that, and this is how it is. You might be the only one that she listens to and that she respects, that she can hear that from.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one more. We've got one more, and then we can jump off. It says, Can you talk a bit more about dealing with minority groups in the community when trying to immerse yourself in their culture who are resistant to you being there? For example, a white woman took her child to the park and a Black woman grabbed her child and said, "We don't play with white kids." Yeah, thank you for sending this. You know, this is in a short 2-minute answer because we got 2 minutes left. Immersing yourself in a different community is hard, period. It's hard. And we cannot have this expectation that it's going to be easy. And so when you know that you're the only one who's going to the playground, and this playground has people of a different racial makeup, then you need to realize that what you're walking into is an environment that may not be safe for you. And it may not be safe for you because you're a little bit nervous because you're the only one that's there that looks like you. But what's so important to realize, especially if you're white, I don't know who sent this and what their racial group is, but the example was if a white woman took her child to a park and a Black woman grabbed it, you have to understand when you're walking into somebody else's community, and that is a community that they love, and that is their sanctuary, and that is their safe space, even if it's not that to you, it is that to them, that you need to earn their respect. They don't want you there. You are seen as a threat to their safe space. So I think understanding that going into it, right? And I know we speak a lot in racial terms. I speak a lot in racial terms because that's who I am. But even if you are somebody who's middle class, going into the projects, right? Even if you're Black, if I'm walking up in the projects, they're going to look at me and be like, "What you doing here? You don't belong here." And they are right. Okay. So understanding that when we're entering into these cultural spaces, part of exercising humility is understanding this power and privilege that we bring and knowing that on the front end and not having any expectations otherwise. That's a very short answer, and I'm sure it's more nuanced, but I hope that that was helpful. Y'all have been wonderful. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. This brings me so much joy to talk to social workers. And so please honestly reach out if you have any other questions or need some more context or dialogue along things. Okay. Best of luck to you all. Thanks for being great social workers.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thank you so much.